The morning began like any other. The sky was clear, the sun was shining brightly, and the world seemed at peace. People went about their daily routines, unaware that something extraordinary was about to change their lives forever. It all started with a strange, low hum that no one could explain. At first it was so faint that most people thought it was just the wind or a passing aircraft. But as the hum grew louder, something deep within the air seemed to shift. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath. In cities across the world from New York to Tokyo, people looked up to the sky, noticing something unusual. A dark shadow had appeared high above, blocking out the sun. It was not a cloud, nor an airplane. The shape was massive to massive. It moved slowly, like a predator circling its prey. A collective chill ran down the spines of those who saw it. News stations scrambled to broadcast updates, and governments were put on high alert. No one knew what this thing was or where it had come from. It was as if the world was standing still, waiting for something that no one was prepared for. Then, without warning, a voice boomed across every television screen and radio station worldwide. The voice was cold, distant, and somehow full of menace. "We are the Zalthar. Your kind has been under observation for millennia. The time has come for your extinction." The message was simple, but its meaning was terrifying. The Zalthar were not just invaders, they were watchers. They had been watching humanity for ages, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, that moment had arrived. People around the world tried to make sense of it. Scientists, military, experts, and politicians scrambled for answers. But no one knew who the Zalthar were or what they wanted. In just a few seconds, Earth had gone from a peaceful planet to a target on the galactic map. As the days passed, more and more ships began to appear. They were like enormous black shadows in the sky, their shapes hard to comprehend. Some looked like sleek, angular vessels, while others seemed more like floating fortresses. The ships moved with an unsettling precision, blocking out the sky and cutting off all means of communication. No one could contact the outside world, no phone lines, no internet, nothing. The only thing left was the growing sense of dread that filled the air. In the first 24 hours, the world was plunged into chaos. Governments declared martial law, military forces were mobilized, and cities went into lockdown. The public was told to stay inside, but the fear was spreading like wildfire. People were scared of the unknown. The streets, once filled with the sounds of everyday life, were now eerily silent. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, but no one knew what that something was. Then, the Zalthar made their move. Huge ships descended from the sky, landing on Earth with terrifying precision. They landed in the most populated areas: New York, London, Beijing, and Moscow. As the ships touched the ground, their hulls shimmered with an eerie light. The air around them vibrated with an unnatural hum. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being altered by their presence. And then, they began to unleash their weapons. The first attack was swift. Bright beams of energy shot down from the ships, cutting through buildings and infrastructure with ease. In an instant, skyscrapers crumbled to the ground, and entire city blocks were obliterated. The sounds of explosions filled the air, followed by a haunting silence. It was a kind of destruction humanity had never witnessed before, so precise, so powerful, that no one knew how to defend against it. For hours, the world watched in shock and disbelief. Governments attempted to coordinate a response, but their efforts were futile. Earth's military forces, although powerful, stood no chance against the alien technology. The Zalthar had weapons that seemed to defy the laws of physics, that disintegrated everything they touched, shields that repelled anything thrown at them, and ships that could move faster than anything Earth had ever known. The message was clear: Earth was defenseless. Humanity had no choice but to watch as their cities fell one by one. The Zalthar were not here to negotiate. They were not here to talk. They had come to conquer. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected began to happen. People began to fight back. It started as small pockets of resistance, a group of soldiers in one city, a few civilians in another, all taking up arms against the invaders. They had no real plan, no real chance of winning. But there was something deep inside them that refused to let go. Humanity wasn't going to roll over and die, not without a fight. The first few skirmishes were brutal. The human fighters were overwhelmed, outmatched at every turn, but still, they fought on. For every soldier lost, 10 more rose to take their place. They were terrified, yes, but they were not willing to give up their world without a fight. They had no idea who the Zalthar were or what they wanted, but they knew one thing for certain: they were not going to be wiped out without showing the invaders what humanity was truly capable of. As the resistance grew, so did the questions. Why had the Zalthar chosen Earth? What did they want from humanity? And most importantly, how could they stop an enemy so powerful, so unstoppable? The mystery only deepened as the Zalthar began to change their tactics. Rather than continue their attacks, they retreated to their ships, watching from above as humanity scrambled to understand what was happening. The calm before the storm was unsettling. Everyone could feel it. The silence was just as dangerous as the chaos. And so, the world waited. Humanity had been pushed to the brink, but they were not finished yet. The question was no longer whether they could survive. It was whether they could fight back. The first few hours after the Zalthar arrived were marked by panic and confusion. But as the days passed, the realization sank in. Earth was under siege. People clung to the hope that the alien invasion was just a misunderstanding, that the Zalthar might leave as mysteriously as they had come. But those hopes quickly turned to despair as the first full-scale attack was launched. It wasn't just the weapons of mass destruction raining down from their ships, it was the sheer scale of it. These were no ordinary invaders. The Zalthar had the power to wipe out entire cities in moments, and they were doing it with terrifying precision. Across the world, the initial shock had given way to action. Governments issued evacuation orders, but it was too late for many. The damage had already been done. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble in the blink of an eye. The once thriving urban landscapes now lay in ruin, with nothing but dust and ash in the air. There was no fighting back, not yet. Earth's military forces scrambled, but their weapons were useless against the alien technology. No matter how many soldiers they sent, no matter how many tanks they deployed, the Zalthar tore through their defenses effortlessly. As the days turned into weeks, the world began to see a pattern. The Zalthar weren't just interested in conquering the Earth, they were making a statement. Earth and humanity were insignificant to them. They were like hunters, picking off the weakest prey first, showing no mercy, leaving only destruction in their wake. The Zalthar moved across the planet, systematically dismantling the cities and military outposts that had once been symbols of human power. With each attack, humanity's hope dwindled, yet something else began to stir deep within them, a stubborn resolve, something primal. There was no immediate sign of what the Zalthar truly wanted from Earth. They had never made it clear, but humanity had one thing that the aliens clearly didn't anticipate: an unyielding will to survive. The global resistance had begun. It wasn't a well-organized army. In fact, it was anything but. At first it was simply small groups of people, civilians, soldiers, even scientists coming together in makeshift bunkers and underground cities. The world's governments had collapsed, but humanity wasn't going to fall with them. The survivors, from all corners of the Earth, had only one goal in mind: survive long enough to figure out what the Zalthar wanted, and how they could stop them. In the rubble of ruined cities, these pockets of resistance began to form plans. Their weapons were primitive compared to the Zalthar's arsenal, but their minds were sharp, and they were ready to do whatever it took to defend their planet. They gathered anything that could be used: a few old fighter jets, makeshift explosives, even small arms from abandoned military stockpiles. It was nothing compared to what they were up against, but it was all they had. Among these first bands of resistance fighters were some of Earth's best and brightest. A former soldier named Captain Ree, who had survived the fall of New York, began organizing small-scale attacks on alien outposts. She was a sharp strategist, and though her forces were small and poorly equipped, she used the terrain and the element of surprise to her advantage. She quickly became one of the first leaders of the global resistance. But even her success was fleeting. Each victory was met with a swift and brutal retaliation from the Zalthar, and as quickly as they had gained ground, they would lose it again. But every victory, no matter how small, fueled the fire of rebellion. The resistance was growing. It wasn't just soldiers anymore. Everyday people, fathers, mothers, teachers, engineers, were taking up arms and joining the fight. In underground bunkers and hidden labs, a new wave of innovation began. The survivors started to reverse engineer alien technology, using what little they could capture from the wreckage of the Zalthar ships. In cities that had once seemed like untouchable fortresses, new weapons were developed. Makeshift EMP devices, laser-guided missiles, and crude power shields began to see use. Though these innovations were far from perfect, they gave humanity a glimpse of hope. They showed that humanity wasn't as defenseless as it had seemed. But the Zalthar weren't careless. They had been watching humanity for years, and they were methodical in their approach. The aliens weren't in any rush. They knew humanity's weaknesses all too well. and with each failed counterattack they learned more about how to crush the resistance. The Zalthar continued their relentless campaign, leaving a trail of desolation behind them. Yet, despite the alien force's overwhelming power, something began to change. The resistance wasn't breaking, it was adapting. The more humanity fought, the more they discovered about their enemy. It wasn't just the technology that was alien, it was their tactics, too. The Zalthar operated as a highly coordinated hive mind, their communication fast and flawless. They had no emotions, no room for mercy, only cold, calculated destruction. But that also meant they couldn't understand humanity's drive, its need to push back no matter the odds. On the ground, scattered reports began to emerge. The Zalthar ships, despite their power, were not invincible. They had weaknesses, small, unnoticed vulnerabilities that could be exploited. It was a glimmer of hope, a small opening for humanity to gain an edge in one particular underground laboratory. A team of scientists led by Dr. Alina Price worked day and night, trying to reverse engineer a weapon that could take down the alien fleet. It was an enormous challenge. The Zalthar technology was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered, and understanding it seemed almost impossible. But slowly, with every test, with every failure, they began to understand more. They were getting closer. Humanity was learning, and though the Zalthar were still destroying everything in their path, something had changed deep within humanity. They had gone from frightened, scattered survivors to something stronger, something more united. They had been pushed to the brink of extinction, but they had not given up. They had found a way to fight back. In the darkness, a spark was lit, and as the Zalthar prepared for their next assault, the humans were ready to meet them head-on. They would not flee, they would not bow, they would stand and fight. The resistance was no longer just a desperate struggle for survival, it was a war, and humanity wasn't going to let the Zalthar have their world without a fight. The battle for Earth had taken on a new rhythm, one of desperation mixed with fierce determination. The resistance, once a scattered and disorganized group of survivors, had transformed into something far more formidable. Despite the devastation around them, humanity refused to submit. They had learned much about the Zalthar in the weeks since the invasion, and with that knowledge came a dangerous sense of possibility. They were beginning to understand their enemy, not just their technology, but their psychology, their way of thinking. Humanity had been underestimated. As the dust settled in the aftermath of another failed assault on the alien fleet, a new plan began to take shape. Dr. Alina Price, the lead scientist behind the reverse engineering of Zalthar technology, had discovered something unexpected, a weakness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fuel the next phase of humanity's resistance. The Zalthar ships, despite their immense power, had an energy core. This core, located deep within their vessels, was vulnerable to high-frequency electromagnetic pulses. If they could disable the core, even temporarily, they might have a chance of crippling the fleet. The discovery sent shockwaves through the underground labs where the resistance was working. For the first time since the invasion began, there was a tangible hope. But there was a catch: the EMPs they needed to create to take down the Zalthar ships weren't something that could be easily manufactured. The technology required was advanced, far beyond what humanity had used before. It was a long shot, a gamble, but it was the only chance they had left. In the heart of Europe, a small, resilient group of engineers and scientists worked tirelessly to build the devices. The pressure was unbearable. The Zalthar ships loomed overhead, their dark forms blocking out the sun as they continued their campaign of destruction. The ticking of the clock seemed to echo louder with every passing moment. If they didn't act quickly, humanity's last hope might slip away. But the group pressed on. If they succeeded, it could turn the tide of the war. Meanwhile, scattered across the globe, humanity's resistance forces were starting to come together in a more coordinated effort. The small groups that had fought in isolation now found themselves connecting, forming alliances, and pooling resources. Communications between survivors, once unreliable and fragmented, were now being restored with the help of makeshift satellites and old communication towers. The survivors weren't just surviving anymore, they were starting to fight as a single, unified force. Captain Ree, a seasoned military officer who had led several successful counterattacks, was now one of the most recognized leaders in the resistance. She had once commanded a small group of soldiers during the fall of New York, but now, she led hundreds, perhaps thousands of fighters, all drawn to her unwavering resolve. She understood the stakes more than anyone. She knew the didn't care about diplomacy or negotiation. They had no interest in coexisting. For them, humanity was simply an obstacle to be removed. There was no peace, no compromise. There was only victory or annihilation. That it was in the deep tunnels of an abandoned military base that Captain Ree and her forces began preparing for their next major operation. The intelligence they had gathered showed that the Zolthar had begun to regroup in a massive stronghold, a floating fortress that hovered high above the ruins of the eastern United States. The fortress was heavily defended, and it seemed to be the center of their operations. The plan was simple: the heart of their command structure, disable the fleet's coordination, and create chaos among the Zolthar ranks. If they could create enough confusion, the EMPs would have a better chance of succeeding. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the best shot they had. The team worked quickly to prepare the assault. Soldiers trained in guerrilla tactics, engineers, ready with their modified weapons, and a small unit of crack fighters who had experience in infiltration were all part of the mission. Everyone knew the risks. No one was under any illusions about the likelihood of survival, but the desperation in their eyes was unmistakable. Humanity had nothing left to lose. That as the final pieces of the plan fell into place, the group launched their attack. They moved in the dead of night, using the cover of darkness to get as close as possible to the floating fortress. They navigated through burned-out cities, crumbling highways, and desolate landscapes. The silence was deafening. It felt as though the whole world had been swallowed by the Zolthar invasion. The hum of alien ships overhead was a constant reminder that they were being watched, that they were still prey in a much larger game. They approached the fortress, and the gravity of the situation became real. The structure itself was a massive, hovering fortress that seemed to pulse with energy, surrounded by an army of smaller Zolthar ships. But the resistance had a plan, one that required precision and secrecy. The key to the operation was infiltration. They needed to slip past the enemy's defenses without being detected. Once inside, they could plant the EMP devices deep within the heart of the fortress, aiming to disable the core and trigger a chain reaction that would cripple the entire fleet. The resistance fighters moved swiftly, their every step calculated and deliberate. Captain Ree led the charge, her heart pounding as they neared the entrance to the fortress. The alien guards patrolled in intervals, their sleek, armored bodies gliding silently through the air. The humans crept past them, relying on shadows and the element of surprise to avoid detection. Thus they reached the core of the fortress. The tension was palpable. The room was filled with strange, glowing symbols and alien machinery. The resistance fighters could feel the power humming through the air, the same energy that had devastated entire cities. It was overwhelming, but they had no time to waste. They placed the EMPs as quickly as possible, setting the timers and hoping that their hastily devised plan would work. It was a race against time. As the team retreated to their exit point, alarms suddenly blared across the fortress. They had been detected. The Zolthar were closing in. Captain Ree's heart raced. The escape route had been compromised, and they had no choice but to fight their way out. The resistance fighters prepared for one final push, their weapons drawn and their spirits high. They had come this far, and they weren't going to back down now. The explosions rocked the fortress, the EMPs doing their work. The core faltered, sending shockwaves through the alien command center. Chaos erupted within the Zolthar ranks, as their once precise coordination faltered. It was the opening humanity needed, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. In the smoke and confusion, the resistance fought with everything they had, pushing forward toward the exit. It was a bitter, costly victory, but it was one step closer to the end of the war. And as the last of the resistance forces made their escape, they knew something had changed. The Zolthar weren't invincible. Humanity had shown them that. They had made the first real dent in the enemy's armor, and now, the fight was on. The EMPs had worked. The Zolthar's powerful, imposing ships faltered, their core systems flickering as the electromagnetic pulses surged through their vulnerable circuits. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The Zolthar were not invincible. That much was clear. But while their fleet had been momentarily crippled, the war was far from over. The moment of triumph was brief, like a flame igniting in the darkness, and quickly dimmed by the harsh reality of what lay ahead. Humanity had just made its first major breakthrough, but the Zolthar weren't about to give up. No, they were far too dangerous, too strategic for that. They had underestimated humanity once, but they wouldn't make the same mistake again. The alien force regrouped quickly, launching a series of retaliatory strikes that were swift and brutal. The damage humanity had inflicted on their fleet was only temporary, but the real consequences were about to unfold. With every strike from the Zalthar, the resistance was pushed further into hiding. But in the midst of this overwhelming power, something else began to shift. Resistance fighters had become more than just soldiers, they had become symbols. The heroes of the moment, those who stood firm against impossible odds, began to inspire others across the globe. People who had once been paralyzed by fear, unsure of how to fight back, now found themselves joining the cause. Every man, woman, and child who had witnessed the strength of the resistance felt a new surge of determination. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about standing up, about proving that humanity's spirit was not so easily broken. Captain Ree, now a symbol of that spirit, continued to lead with a fire in her eyes. She knew that every victory was hard-won, and every loss took its toll, but she also understood that without resistance, Earth would fall. Her team, though battered and bloodied, had gained ground in their mission. The EMP attack had weakened the Zalthar's grip on Earth temporarily, but it was now clear that humanity had to do more than just react. They had to take the fight to the aliens. The question was, how? In the ruins of once great cities, the resistance gathered, their faces grim but resolute. There were no longer any illusions that they could simply defend Earth. They had to go on the offensive. But attacking the Zalthar directly was an impossible task. Their ships were powerful, their technology far beyond anything humanity had. And yet, they had seen cracks in the aliens' near-invincible facade. If humanity could exploit those weaknesses, they might stand a chance. It was in a hidden lab deep beneath the surface of a destroyed metropolis that humanity's next plan began to take shape. Alina Price, the scientist who had first discovered the Zalthar's vulnerability, had a new idea, an idea so dangerous that even she hesitated to share it. What if they could disrupt not just the Zalthar ships, but their entire command structure? What if they could sever the link between their fleet and the alien forces coordinating it? The idea was simple in theory, but almost impossible to pull off. The Zalthar ships communicated through a complex network of neural links, a sort of hive mind that allowed them to move with incredible precision and coordination. If the link could be severed, the Zalthar would be thrown into disarray. The question was, how could humans disrupt a neural network so alien and advanced? Alina and her team worked day and night, trying to reverse engineer a device that could infiltrate the Zalthar's communication system. The clock was ticking. Every day, more and more cities fell. Humanity had no more time to waste. The pressure mounted, but just when it seemed like they might have no hope left, Alina made a breakthrough. They had found a way to hack into the Zalthar's communication network using a device that could mimic the neural signals of their ships. It was a gamble, a dangerous one. The device was untested, and there was no telling what kind of consequences there would be if it failed. But the more Alina thought about it, the more she realized that there was no choice. The alternative was surrender, a fate too grim to consider. They would fight, even if it meant pushing their technology to its limits. They would hack the Zalthar's neural network, sever their coordination, and watch as the alien invaders fell into chaos. The resistance fighters, many of whom had already fought multiple battles, were ready. They had been trained for this moment. Their targets were clear, key locations where the Zalthar maintained their command centers, the hubs that controlled the neural network. It was time to strike. Under the cover of darkness, the resistance moved in. Their mission was simple, perilous: infiltrate the Zalthar command structures, plant the device, and trigger the disruption. As they approached the first of these high-security facilities, the air was thick with tension. The Zalthar's defenses were formidable, and every step they took brought them closer to certain death if they were discovered. But humanity's drive was stronger than their fear. Infiltrating the facility was the first challenge. The Zalthar had set up elaborate traps and alarms, but the resistance had learned to adapt. Using stolen alien technology and their own ingenuity, they bypassed the security systems, working in silence. The silence was deafening, each step of their journey through the compound fraught with the risk of detection. Every soldier moved like shadows, their movements precise and calculated. Finally, they reached the heart of the facility, a room filled with humming alien machinery and glowing neural interfaces. The tension was unbearable as Elena's team carefully connected the device to the alien system. Their breathing was shallow, their minds focused. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything would be over. But they worked together, their hands steady despite the enormity of the task before them. And then, as the final connection was made, the device activated. A low, pulsating hum filled the room, and the neural network shuddered. The Zalth, once perfect coordination faltered. the hive mind splintering, causing confusion among their ranks. The resistance fighters couldn't help but smile as they realized it was working. The Zalthar, for the first time, were no longer a unified force. They were vulnerable. But their victory was not without consequence. The Zalthar retaliated quickly, launching waves of soldiers in an attempt to regain control. The resistance was forced into a brutal fight for their lives, holding their ground as best as they could. Every soldier fought with everything they had, knowing that if they failed, humanity's hope would be dashed forever. In the chaos that ensued, one thing became clear. The resistance had struck a blow, and the Zalthar were no longer invincible. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. Humanity had found its strength, and the aliens now knew that they were not facing a helpless species. The war was about to get much, much more intense. The moment the neural network disrupted, a kind of stillness fell over the battlefield. For the first time since the Zalthar had arrived, humanity could see a glimmer of hope. The once unified, impenetrable alien forces were in disarray. The Zalthar ships, which had once seemed unstoppable, now appeared disjointed and erratic. Their movements were no longer synchronized, and their attacks lost the precision that had made them so terrifying. The resistance had cracked their armor, but that was only the beginning. Captain Ree stood with her eyes fixed on the shifting alien ships above. The news of the success of the neural hack had spread quickly through the ranks of the resistance. The Zalthar were scrambling. Their hive mind, the very thing that had made them a nearly unbeatable force, was now a weakness. The enemy, once so sure of their dominance, was now vulnerable. But Ree knew they couldn't afford to relax. The disruption was only temporary. The Zalthar would adapt. They always did. The tide had turned in humanity's favor, but the battle was far from over, and the clock was ticking. Gathering her most trusted officers, Ree quickly formed a strategy. They had an opportunity, a window in time when the Zalthar were vulnerable. Their fleet was in chaos, their once mighty ships now operating in a disjointed fashion. The resistance had to hit them hard, hit them fast. They could never have a chance like this again. Meanwhile, across the globe, the resistance's morale soared. The war that had once seemed unwinnable now appeared to be on the brink of humanity's favor. Yet, as the day passed, the reality of the war set in. Every victory had been costly, and even now, as the Zalthar struggled to regain control, the resistance knew the next move would be a high-stakes gamble. In the shadows of ruined cities, the resistance fighters began to mobilize. Groups of soldiers, technicians, and civilians are unified under a single cause, prepared for the largest assault humanity had yet made. Their targets were the Zalthar command centers, scattered across the globe. Now vulnerable, the EAPs had crippled their ships, but it was the control hubs that still held their power. If those fell, it would be a devastating blow to the alien invaders. The Zalthar, without their command structure, would be a fractured force. It was time to finish what they had started. As they assembled for the final assault, there was no time for hesitation. This was a moment of reckoning. The global resistance, once a mere flicker of rebellion in a hopeless world, had become an unstoppable force, a well-coordinated army. They had the element of surprise, the advantage of unpredictability. But even with all that, it didn't feel like enough. The alien invaders were still dangerous, their weapons far beyond anything humanity had, and there was no guarantee that the chaos they had created would last. It was Captain Ree's plan that would lead the charge. She had scouted the Zalthar's command center on the east coast of the United States, an enormous fortress floating high above the ground, surrounded by a swarm of Zalthar ships. The fortress was heavily defended, its outer walls lined with shields that would take an army to breach. But Ree knew the aliens. They were relentless, calculating. If there was one thing humanity could count on, it was their ability to turn the tide in moments of desperation. A small team of resistance fighters, led by Captain Ree, would infiltrate the fortress's outer defenses, using stolen alien technology to bypass the ship's cloaking shields. The rest of the resistance would launch a diversion, creating chaos in the skies and on the ground. The idea was simple. The aliens wouldn't know what hit them. The plan was risky, yes, but it was humanity's only shot at victory. Ree and her team moved quickly, taking advantage of the disarray in the Zalthar fleet. They approached the fortress under cover of darkness, moving swiftly through the streets of the city that had been reduced to rubble. The quiet before the storm felt surreal. Everything was set in motion now, and there would be no turning back. As they neared the base, the air seemed to hum with tension. The Zalthar ships were barely aware of their approach, distracted by the ongoing chaos the diversionary force was causing. The team slipped past the defenses, their movements swift and silent. They were in, and now it was time to plant the final EMP, the one that would disable the core of the Zulthar command center, the heart of the alien fleet. The deeper they ventured into the heart of the fortress, the more unsettling it became. The air was thick with alien energy and strange humming. Machinery filled every corner. The Zulthar, it seemed, were more than just invaders. This place, the fortress, was a testament to their cold, ruthless intelligence. It was a machine in itself, a monument to their conquest, to their belief that no species could ever challenge their might. Captain Ree's heart raced as they reached the core of the fortress. The EMP device, a terrifyingly complex piece of technology, was ready, but time was slipping away. The longer they stayed, the more likely the Zulthar would realize what was happening. They had to act quickly. Every second counted as they prepared to plant the device. Alarms suddenly blared, echoing through the halls of the fortress. The Zulthar had detected their presence. Within moments, the corridors were swarming with alien soldiers. The team's cover had been blown, the escape route had been compromised, and now there was no choice but to fight. The resistance, that vastly outnumbered, held their ground, fighting with every ounce of strength they had. Bullets whizzed through the air, and explosions rocked the walls. It was chaos, an all-out battle for survival, but there was no turning back now. The EMP had to be activated. If it worked, the alien command structure would fall apart. The entire Zulthar fleet could be shattered. Ree's team fought with everything they had, pushing through the chaos. In the middle of the battle, she made a desperate dash for the control panel that would activate the EMP. With a final, breathless push, she activated the device. The hum of the machine echoed through the fortress as the pulse began to build. Moments later, a blinding flash of light erupted, followed by a deafening wave of energy. The Zulthar command center shuddered, and for a moment, everything stopped. The alien ships outside the fortress flickered, their systems shutting down. One by one, the control network was severed. The Zulthar had lost their grip on the Earth, but the victory came at a price. The resistance fighters had given everything they had, and many didn't make it out alive. The battlefield was littered with fallen soldiers, heroes who had fought for something larger than themselves. And though the alien fleet was now in disarray, the war was far from over. Humanity had struck a decisive blow, but it was just one step in the long fight ahead. The Zulthar weren't done. They would regroup, and they would come back stronger. But for the first time since the invasion began, humanity had the upper hand. The fight was no longer about survival, it was about victory. The Zulthar had been thrown into turmoil, their once impenetrable command structure shattered. The pulse from the EMP had done its job, crippling the alien fleet's coordination and throwing their forces into disarray. But even as the resistance celebrated their hard-won victory, Captain Ari knew they couldn't afford to linger in complacency. The battle was far from over. Humanity had made its mark, but the Zulthar were not the type to surrender quietly. They would adapt. They always did. Though in the wake of the EMP strike, Ree's team had managed to regroup, but they were battered and broken. The resistance was growing stronger, yes, but the cost of victory weighed heavily on them. The Zulthar may have lost their nerve momentarily, but they would not stay down for long. Humanity's enemies were too organized, too brutal. Their technology was far more advanced, and their sheer will to conquer the galaxy couldn't be underestimated. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, something had shifted. The world had changed. Humanity's spirit had been tested, and in the face of extinction, it had proven unbreakable. But it was not just the victory of one battle that fueled this newfound resolve. It was the realization that the Zulthar weren't just invaders. They were part of something much larger. They were one piece of a galactic empire that had been wiping out species across the stars. And humanity, unlike the other worlds before them, had not folded. Across the remnants of the war-torn world, pockets of resistance, fighters, scientists, and survivors from every corner of the globe had begun to consolidate their forces. They were not just fighting for their homes anymore. They were fighting for the future of every planet the Zulthar had ever set foot on. There was a greater purpose now, a shared cause that had become the beating heart of Earth's last stand. Earth was not just another world to be conquered. It was a symbol, a testament to the resilience of all life in the galaxy. As Captain Ree looked at the gathered resistance, she saw more than just a collection of soldiers. She saw the last bastion of humanity, the last flicker of hope in a universe on the brink of being crushed. They were no longer just a disjointed group fighting for survival. They were becoming a unified force, an army of defiance. Their cause was clear. They would not be wiped out. They would stand their ground, no matter what the Zulthar threw at them. The attacks on Earth were growing more intense, but the resistance had adapted. They were no longer reacting to the Zulthar. They were now planning, striking, and counterattacking with purpose. With every alien ship that fell, humanity learned more about their enemy, about their technology, their tactics, their weaknesses. The once impenetrable alien fleet was beginning to crack under the pressure. It wasn't just the EMPs anymore. Humanity had learned to fight in a way the Zalthar couldn't anticipate. The resistance had become unpredictable, and that was a weapon in itself. The Zalthar, aware of the growing threat, began to regroup in earnest. They fortified their positions, strengthened their fleets, and brought in reinforcements from beyond Earth's solar system. But the more they pressed their advantage, the more they realized they were being tested in ways they had never expected. The human spirit, it seemed, could not be crushed. Every time they thought they had driven humanity to the brink, a new wave of resistance would rise from the ashes, stronger and more determined than before, and now, the tide was turning in ways the Zalthar could not ignore. Humanity was beginning to strike back, not just with brute force, but with strategy, with intelligence, and with the unrelenting will to survive. Captain Rhys stood at the heart of it all, coordinating with generals and resistance leaders from all over the planet. They had learned to move as one, to strike quickly and fade into the shadows before the Zalthar could react. The larger, organized attacks were becoming less frequent, replaced by surgical strikes against the Zalthar's remaining strongholds. The resistance wasn't just fighting, they were winning, slowly but surely. Rhys' team, though weary, had a new plan in mind. They knew the Zalthar were still dangerous, but they also knew that the key to victory lay in the final, decisive blow. The EMP had shown them one crucial thing: the Zalthar's greatest strength was their reliance on their advanced technology. It was a vulnerability. If humanity could destroy their remaining ships, if they could disable the alien communications network for good, it would leave the invaders scattered and lost. And that would be the moment the resistance needed to end the war. It was a bold plan, one that would require everything humanity had left. The Zalthar was strong, but humanity had something they didn't: tenacity. They would find a way to strike at the heart of the Zalthar fleet and ensure the destruction of their leadership. The EMPs had worked once, but this time, the resistance would have to hit the alien heart directly. As the resistance gathered for what would be their final assault, Rhys couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Just months ago, Earth had been on the brink of annihilation, with humanity scattered, divided, and powerless. But now, humanity stood united. They had grown stronger with every battle, with every loss, and with every triumph. It wasn't just about Earth anymore. It was about the future of every civilization in the galaxy that the Zalthar threatened to destroy. The final assault would come soon. The plan was set into motion: strike at the heart of the Zalthar's remaining fleets, disable their weapons, and sever their communication lines for good. With the EMP device ready, the human forces readied their attack. SYE's team, alongside thousands of resistance fighters, boarded their ships. The finality of the moment hit them. This was it, the moment that would define their future. If they succeeded, the Zalthar would be forced to retreat, and humanity would win the war. If they failed, Earth might finally fall. But failure was not an option, and so, the final push began. Humanity was no longer just fighting for their survival. They were fighting for the future of every world the Zalthar had ever tried to conquer. With one last, united effort, they would take back what was rightfully theirs. The Zalthar had underestimated them before. This time humanity would show them just how wrong they were. The final battle loomed on the horizon like a storm cloud, dark and heavy with the weight of everything humanity had fought for. The air was thick with tension as the resistance gathered for their most dangerous mission yet: to strike the heart of the Zalthar fleet and end the war once and for all. Every member of the resistance knew the cost of failure. But failure had never been an option, not after everything they had sacrificed, not after all they had endured. Captain Rhys stood at the helm of the Resistance's flagship, staring out into the vast, star-filled expanse of space. The Zalthar ships, sleek and terrifying, hovered ominously in the distance, their dark forms casting a long shadow over the battlefield. The alien forces had been relentless, sweeping across the planet like a wave of destruction, but now, for the first time since the invasion began, the resistance was prepared to take the fight to them. No longer were they scattered pockets of humanity fighting for survival. They were an army, united under a single cause, ready to make a final stand. The plan was simple, yet fraught with danger. They would infiltrate the heart of the Zalthar remaining command fleet, a massive fortress-like ship orbiting the Earth, and disable it. Their target, the core of the Zalthar Central Command, the neural network that had once controlled their entire fleet with perfect precision. If the resistance could destroy it, the Zolthar's fleet would fall apart. Their coordination would collapse, and the alien invaders would be forced to retreat. But the journey to the fortress would be anything but easy. The Zelthar had fortified their position, and they weren't going down without a fight. Humanity would face wave after wave of alien ships, each one stronger and more sophisticated than anything the Resistance had encountered before. The final assault would be a gauntlet of destruction, a fight for every inch of ground, and every soldier knew they might not make it out alive. As the Resistance ships powered forward, Captain Rhee's mind raced with thoughts of her comrades, the soldiers, scientists, civilians, and children who had fought and died alongside her. They had faced impossible odds, but they had never wavered. She thought of the first days of the war, when humanity had been nothing more than prey to the Now, they were predators themselves, hunting down the invaders with everything they had. The first wave of Zalthar ships appeared in the distance, their black holes gleaming under the dim light of distant stars. They were massive, their sleek, angular designs exuding an aura of cold, alien intelligence. The Resistance fighters braced themselves, knowing that their every move would be watched by an enemy that had never known defeat. The Zolthar might have been vulnerable in their disarray, but they still possessed overwhelming firepower. Every battle fought until now had been a brutal skirmish, but this was going to be the war's decisive moment. The Resistance fleet moved as one, weaving in and out of asteroid fields and debris, using the environment to their advantage. They had learned to fight in the shadows, striking when the Zalthar least expected it. As they neared the alien fortress, a barrage of weapons fire erupted from the Zalthar ships, slashing through the darkness like deadly streaks of light. The space around them became a maelstrom of explosions and gunfire, each impact shaking the ships to their core. But the Resistance did not falter. They had trained for this moment, every soldier, every pilot, every engineer, working together as one unit. The Resistance fighters launched their own counterattacks, firing powerful missiles and laser blasts that cut through the enemy's shields. The air was thick with the sound of weaponry and the hum of the engines, the tension palpable as the two forces clashed in the void of space. In the midst of the battle, Captain Rhee's voice crackled over the comms. "Stay focused. We push through, no matter the cost. The moment we break their line, we go for the core. This is humanity's last chance. We won't stop until the job's done." Her words fueled the resolve of every Resistance fighter, pushing them onward into the heart of the enemy's defenses. As their ships moved deeper into the Zalthar's defensive perimeter, the Resistance encountered waves of alien drones, sent to intercept them before they could reach the fortress. The drones, designed for speed and precision, darted through space like swarms of deadly bees, their weapons flashing in all directions. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, humanity fought with a strength born from desperation. Resistance fighters engaged the drones with a fury, using every maneuver, every tactic they had learned to stay one step ahead. Explosions rang out as enemy ships were destroyed in a fiery blaze, but the Resistance ships pressed on, their crews refusing to back down. Finally, the flagship, with Captain Rhee at the helm, reached the outer rim of the fortress. The Zalthar's last line of defense stood between them and their goal, the neural core. It was protected by layers of energy shields, each one more powerful than the last, and an array of heavily armed alien ships that guarded it like a fortress. The Resistance fleet had taken heavy losses, but they were close. They could feel the pulse of the final battle pounding in their chests. With a final calculated maneuver, Captain Rhee's flagship broke through the last shield, and they found themselves on the other side, within range of the core. The ship shuddered as a volley of enemy fire struck their hull, but they pressed on, targeting the heart of the Zalthar fleet. The rest of the Resistance fleet formed a protective barrier around them, fending off the remaining enemy ships with every last ounce of strength they had. The final charge was a blur of motion, a rush of desperate hope. Captain Rhee's ship descended into the heart of the fortress, cutting through the chaos, and finally reached the neural core. The EMP device, a weapon capable of disabling the entire Zalthar fleet, was activated. There was a moment of silence as the pulse surged through the alien structure, followed by a massive wave of energy that rippled outward, shattering the alien shields and causing the fortress to tremble. And then, the unthinkable happened. The Zalthar fleet, once so powerful, was left helpless in the void. Their communication systems shut down, their weapons faltered, and their ships began to drift aimlessly in space. The Resistance had done it. They had severed the Zalthar's connection to their hive mind, and with it their ability to fight. The battle was over. The Zelthar, though vast and powerful, had been defeated by a force that they could never have predicted. Humanity's resilience. As Captain Rhys stood in the command center, her hands trembling as the magnitude of their victory settled in, she couldn't help but think of the countless lives that had been lost along the way. The sacrifice, the courage, the fear, all of it had led to this moment. Humanity had stood tall when every other species had fled and fought. They had won, and the universe would know their name.